And so today we are talking about strawberries. We've been, I myself planted my strawberries last Saturday, and my family's always grown a kind of what we call a patch of strawberries um, ever since I was little. So we'll start off with this. And if you have a question, you can either do ask there, or I'm going to try to set up where I can see the chat box if it will let me. Let's see here. I will try to keep a view of that chat box. All right. So, strawberries for the home gardener. So, when we're talking about establishing strawberries, and that's how I'm going to start this off, is from establishment to the end, and going into maintenance. There's a lot of things that go into this. Strawberries are actually, to me, fairly easy to produce in a home garden, as long as you start them off right. So we'll go through site selection, a little bit of soil fertility, planting practices, production systems, variety selection, plant care, after harvest, maintenance as well. So site selection. Some issues to think about is where the field's going to be located, how it's ornated, what kind of air drainage you're going to have, and water drainage. So when we look at this, in general, we prefer the beds to be a north to south orientation. And it just allows the berries to be more uniform. It's not going to kill you if that's not what it is, right? Especially for home production. But just be aware that the other orientations, you'll have a part of the bed that'll be shaded, part of the bed will be more in the sun. And so you may have smaller berries in one part versus another. The exposure, so southern facing slopes, they're going to be earlier harvested. They're going to, earlier frost protection may be an issue there. But like a north facing slope, you're going to have later harvest. But in general, if it's a home garden, you work with what you have. It is what it is. But some of the key things to think about is having good drainage at the site, and having a place for that water to go. I did put this in here, and most of us would not do this, but you can get a sprinkler system and use, you see every year in Florida, they're protecting the strawberries because there's been an early frost and that sort of thing. They actually add about 1.5 to 2 inches of water per acre to do that. And you actually can technically do that in your home garden. I personally never have, but I did add that in there as an option if you end up with some early frost. As we're looking at this, some things to think about that sometimes can catch people is to avoid fields that have had potatoes in them, tobacco, peppers, eggplants, and this is due to vermiculite wilt. However, there's several varieties that are fairly resistant to vermiculite wilt. So it just depends on what varieties you pick and watching this, where they can carry that disease back and forth. And if the field has been in perennial weeds pretty high, that could be an issue for strawberries. So just kind of a better site would be one that's probably had the garden in before, or a new looking site. And we'll show you some different alternatives as well that we can look at. But soil testing, I did a whole session on soil testing, so I won't go into that too much. If you missed that, you can actually go to my Facebook page for our office and pull that up, and it'll be all that you ever dared to halfway want to know or not know about soils. But in general, we do need to have proper fertility. In that talk, I did show you this, and this is the required nutrients, or most of the nutrients we need for production. The reason why we worry about nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium so much, which is the 3 common ones you get if you buy 10-10-10, you're buying 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, and 10% potassium. The reason why we worry about so much is they're the most limiting. We need them in the most largest quantity, but we need all the others as well. pH is important to us as well. And I showed you all this and that other presentation, but we have over here on the right, you have the different nutrients, and how wide that band is how much the nutrients is available at the lower axis at the pH of the soil. So strawberries prefer to have a range of 5.6 to 6.5. They're pretty forgiving. Once you get below 5.5, you start having quite a few issues. We kind of prefer them to be around 6, but they're fairly forgiving in terms of pH, in terms of production. So this is all in acres. So if you were wanting to start off and do acres, this is actually what their fertility requirements are in terms of per acre. But I can switch this over, and here it is, just a general recommendation that if you're going to plant them in the garden, how much to do. And if you do a soil test, you can actually put in for strawberries and get back a specific recommendation for your garden, but these are just general recommendations that we give. So we like to go ahead and fertilize before we plant, and that way it's already working in the soil solution. Hopefully it's had some rain, it's starting to break down, but we like to see 4 pounds of 10-10-10 per 100 linear feet a row. And then later on, if you start seeing some weaker transplants or they're lighter in color, you can side dress it. And we kind of prefer ammonium nitrate. If you can't get a hold of ammonium nitrate, you could use 10-10-10, and you could up that amount a little bit. But the limited shallow root system, you initially won't get the benefit of the fertilizer placed in the middle of the rows just because of what the location and that sort of thing. Eventually you will. So a strawberry plant. Strawberry plant is a non-woody perennial composed of crowns, leaves, runners, and a root system. And I'm going to show you a picture of this. And actually, I had my niece with me when we were planting our strawberries, and I told her they were crowns and was trying to explain to her the crowns. But crowns is actually a modified stem, and the leaves, the runners, the branch crowns, the flower clusters, they all come out of that crown. Everything arises out of that. Your leaf size is variable on strawberries. The key thing to realize, though, is that production stops when things get below 32 degrees. And then it gets very slow when it gets hotter than 86 degrees. And that's why strawberries is a cool season fruit for us. That's why it's one of the first fruits we have. And so when it gets hot, it's done. And strawberry is considered an aggregated accessory fruit. But here's your actual diagram of your plant. So you actually have in here, you have the crown, and you can see where everything is branching out of it. And then strawberries send out what we call runners or daughter plants through a stolon. And a stolon is a type of stem as well. It comes from the crown and runs out and starts a new plant. And you're wanting to do that. So planting date. Planting date is now. You can irrigate strawberries even in your home garden. And that's, a great thing. And you can even plant later if you're going to do that. But without irrigation, most of the time we're planting like the end of March to mid-April is kind of the time period that we do. Spacing, usually at least 3 foot between the rows. And then between plants, we usually do 1 foot up to 2 feet, depending on what you're wanting to do. And we'll get more into the different production systems. Whenever you're planting, you want to keep your plants in dormant and cold storage until planting and keep those roots moist. So if you get plants and timing is just not right, I usually just take a paper towel, wet it, and keep it around the roots and keep a check on it. When you plant, you want to keep the crown at soil level. And so this can cause some issues from people from time to time. And the first year of planting, you're going to remove the blossoms. And that's so they actually create those runners and you end up developing a thicker bed. So here is your planting depths. So 2 deep is going all the way to those leaves. Correct, that crown just sits right above the ground. If you see any of the roots, you're too high. And you want to try not to bend those roots. You want them to be hanging down. So that's your actual planting, proper planting there. We have 2 main systems that people kind of use. Traditionally in like a home garden and traditionally before plastic was even invented, we did what's called matted row. So the plants will produce 2 to 5 years. They run, they kind of become a bed. And it's less expensive, but you don't have as many weed control options. And you can have small, dirty berries because of it. For a home garden, this is normally what we're looking at. It's not bad to deal with, pretty easy. And most commercial systems, you'll have annual plastic culture. You can do this in a home garden. But usually they only use the plants for 1 year, maybe 2. It can be more expensive, but you have better controlling of weed options, and you usually have larger, cleaner berries. So here is the kind of the traditional matted row, starting, and these plants are a little bit farther along, but you can see they've got straw in between them. But this is kind of the traditional thing. Usually in my family, we end up letting them run and create a whole solid bed. Others will actually kind of keep out certain runners and go through and thin them out a whole lot more. For matted row, usually we plant the plants anywhere from like 18 to 24 inches apart. You can move them closer, but having the in-between rows is better. More space kind of produces bigger berries. But flower stems on the plants should be removed as soon as they appear. And that allows the plant to be strengthened and have more vigor. And as you let plants run, they recommend that you pull out the older plant as it's not producing as much eventually. Here's your plastic culture. So this is more like what you would see in more commercial production. If you went somewheres, they've got irrigation underneath there. And then they've also got row frost protection covers over top of them that they can set out. Plastic coasters usually, like, they make a huge hill. They usually do 1 foot to 16 inches. And they will remove runners. They try not to really let it run. They remove runners. It can be very expensive. Black culture, the black plastic, what it does is it allows for there to be more heat, so they actually develop sooner. And it's pretty common to see. So plastic culture, some advantages for a home gardener would be that you'd have larger berries, cleaner berries. You'd be easier to see what you're harvesting, not as many weed problems, and pretty much you would destroy the plants and just replant in the fall. So steps that you would take if you were interested in doing that is that you would have to prepare the soil and hill it up. You'd need to do your fertilization, forming that bed. You'd have to come up with how you're going to irrigate and lay your plastic. In between rows, you could plant ryegrass as a weed control option. You'd need to punch holes into your strawberries. Then you set your plants, water your plants, cover them, and you'll have to fertigate them and go through the whole process. So some varieties, and this is something that sometimes people don't realize, is that you do have some extra options in terms of what kind of varieties. So we have what's called June harvest berries, and these are berries that mainly will produce, that we will harvest like towards the end of May and into June. I personally prefer June bearing just because even though it's a smaller window that we can harvest, you end up having less potential for insect problems and disease problems. Day neutral or ever-bearing strawberries work great if you're wanting strawberries several times throughout the year, but you don't get as much, and you can start having insect and disease issues as you go through the season. And even the day neutral berries, what they'll do is they still will stop when temperatures get high, but as temperatures get lower, they start bearing again. And here's a pretty nice little thing here. This just shows you planting distance, minimum distance, and then you have how much yield. So for June bearing, you can have 1 to 2 pounds per plant, and They'll usually start after a years old. So your first year, like I said, you'd pinch off the bloom so they would set out runners. And it says 1 to 2 years there. In my experience, you can keep them 3, 4, 5 years. It just kind of depends. You will see slower production. And then you have everbearing, and everbearing will start bearing that first year. But their life expectancy is the same, but the actual production is reduced. And then you're also getting those at different times. So depends on your goal. If your goal is for you to have some just to eat from time to time, everbearing would be good for you. If you're looking to be able to produce jellies and those sort of things and freeze them, then June bearing I think is better. Some varieties that I like and have used, this is Early Glow. It does have some resistance to vermiculite wilt. It's good for eating, freezing, canning. It's a good sized berry. I like it very well. And then we have All Star. It's a pretty firm fruit, but it's pretty good for eating and freezing. I call it a mid-season berry. It's Early Glow will be one of the first ones you might get, and this one might be like a week off or 2 weeks off from it. And it also has resistant to vermiculite wilt and also red steel, which is another disease. Then we have Jewel, and it's pretty good about dealing with different conditions. But it's kind of a mid to late season berry, so it's going to be one of the later ones. It's excellent for fresh or freezing, and it's got pretty good winter hardness. And then the last one on the June bearing I'll show you is Chandler. Now, Chandler is one of the more common ones you'll find in commercial production. So if you go and buy berries from a commercial farm or from a farmer that is specifically selling berries, most likely they're using Chandler. It's very common, especially in our area. It's not very winter hardy. It's a very firm fruit, and that's one of the reasons why they like it. Has very high yields, but it is actually susceptible to anthracnose. But it's very common in commercial. So if you've been buying from like a local farmer or something, that's a very good chance. For everbearing, I like Seascape. Would go ahead and plant it in the spring, and you'd probably produce a crop, at least by fall. Very high quality, very good fruit. But again, it's one of those things. It's like, when do you want your strawberries to appear? So when we get into harvest, it's very important to try to carefully pull them by the stems and not the caps, because they'll get bruised. And trying to pick all those are ripe. Whenever you leave some ripe ones out there, you end up just inviting insects and that sort of stuff. And you might have issues with more insects that way. And strawberries can be held, as you know, more than a day or two, usually, if you keep them at the proper temperature. But they do need to be held in a refrigerator. So after harvest, and this is for your June bearing, you're going to mow off your plants within 1 inch of the crown, and you can try to thin some out then, remove the oldest plants, and you can try to remove out your weeds and try to prepare to do some mulching. Once we get into fall is when you actually do your mulching. I usually use straw. Some people use pine needles, but you can also use leaves and basically cover over and prepare them for winter. You can also go ahead after you mow and fertilize them, and we have the recommendation there for fertilization. And once they've been established, this is what you traditionally would do, is mow them and then go ahead and fertilize them. And you can fertilize them in early fall of the first year. Some common diseases. So these are some things that I have seen myself. This is anthracnose. A lot of times you'll see this as the plants get older. I find when it's like their first year, it would have to have just the right situation for it to happen. But normally I've seen this if we've tried to keep berries maybe like the 3rd year. And this is something that shows up. You can treat for this, but normally when I've had this with my family, we normally just started a new bed and started in a new area. But this, and anthracnose happens on a lot of different plants. You can find it on trees. It's a very common disease. This is gray mold. Basically, the fruit will almost become like little mummies. Like you'll have a perfectly good fruit, and all of a sudden, like this gray matter will appear on it. It's pretty much mold, and it'll become this mummified fruit. Now, one of the reasons why I like some of the varieties I suggested, All Star, Early Golden Jewel, is that they actually are less susceptible to gray mold. And that's a lot of times some of these can actually are variety dependent, and you can kind of look and see about those sort of things. This is powdery mildew. Powdery mildew is a very common disease for many different plants. I fight this all the time in pumpkins. A lot of times, at least in pumpkins, I don't see this until like later June. And it just depends. We have to have high humidity and the temperatures have to be just right. You'll see it quite often, more so in like greenhouses and plastic culture. You can spray for this if you want to. But with June bearing berries, normally I haven't had this as an issue. For everbearing, I could see it being an issue. So production systems, other than what we talked about. So the two we talked about is kind of your traditional, what you do, but we've got to, in life, there's all kinds of different options out there. So here they've took a barrel and they've actually, that central there, pipe they've put in is to help with watering. But this is, they just cut out holes, filled it with soil, cut out holes and planted plants, and runners will kind of go around that. And that's something you can do. May not last for several years, but it's something that would work. Here's some other things. You could have a raised bed, and this is a raised bed they've done just so that the berries kind of run up and down. Here they've used just regular pots and cut holes in them that they've had around. You can also use pallets. I actually tried this myself. It cuts down on weeds. If you just are a backyard grower and don't want too many, this would work as well. And I actually was lucky enough that I did an Irish exchange and went to Ireland. And Ireland's very big in berries. They stay fairly mild climate. And they actually utilize a system that's from the Dutch. And so I find it interesting in our commercial production here, everything's on the ground and everybody's got to bend over to pick berries. Not over in Europe. In Europe, they actually utilize this system. Everything's up off the ground. They will actually, that's fertigation going through there, and they actually roll a cart through and pick the berries so they don't have to bend over. So I found that very interesting. They do a lot of glass houses and then even like the plastic greenhouses there, or hoop houses. So I found that very interesting. And then these are some resources that you can access if you need to, or if you have more questions, you can always holler at me. But these are some of the ones I used that I liked very well. We have a very good publication out of Virginia Tech on small fruits in the home garden, and it covers a lot of this stuff. So now I'll open it up to questions.